right. So let me just start off by kind of orienting you to the kind of environmental issues that we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about. And from an Austrian economics perspective, I want to try to help you see where the thinking is, and maybe give you some insights into where to start if you are new to the to thinking about this in terms of Austrian economics. So there are really two issues within environmental economics, two main issues. One is resource use, and those are the concerns that people have about depleting oil reserves or open ocean fisheries or recycling, deforestation. And then there are the concerns about spillover effects. And they're really related because I think both of these are related to property rights. If you are familiar with Murray Rothbard's article, Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution, which is in Ethics of Liberty, it was originally in the Cato Journal, but you can find that free online. I think Mises.org has a copy. But those are some of the issues that I want to spend some time on here because they are where there are conflicts over property rights, like who owns the water, who owns the air. And all of these things that I've got listed here, smoking, paper mills, fireworks, steel mills, coal-fired power plants, water pollution of all kinds, all of those really are in that spillover effects category. So one of the pictures that I like to show my students whenever I get an opportunity is this picture that shows the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And if you can see that slide, the right-hand side is very forested and green, and that's the Dominican Republic side. And the left-hand side is rather barren. You can see it looks like somebody's chopped down all the trees. That's the Haitian side. And if you look at the property rights regime in both of those countries, the Economic Freedom Index done by the Fraser Institute is ranks Haiti far below the Dominican Republic. Neither one of them are superstars in terms of economic freedom, but Haiti is definitely lower ranked. In terms of the protection of property rights, a component of that ranking, the Dominican Republic rank it is higher. That a higher number is better in terms of the protection of property rights rating. So it does make a difference if you protect property rights, then that prevents people from simply walking onto a piece of property and cutting down trees that don't belong to them. If you live in a country where those property rights are not well protected, then that's not going to be the case. If you have a typical environmental economics course from your run-of-the-mill university, you're going to see typically the Pigovian approach, named for Arthur Cecil Pigou, and his view was that you can take care of these externality problems by taxing those who are emitting negative externalities or pollution, and you can subsidize those who are generating some kind of positive externality. The regulatory approach is also very, very common. Of course, the EPA is the federal regulatory agency in the United States that promulgates all of these regulations to try to reduce pollution. And in that case, you've got government trying to force reductions in emissions to a level that is deemed socially efficient. And then you've got a kind of a property rights-based approach. And even within this, there are divisions. You've got the what is more of a mainstream idea here, which is that the Kos theorem is part of this, that if you simply define property rights well enough, then the individuals will sort this out on their own. And Harold Dimsetz is another kind of Kosian that you might. In fact, Harold Dimsetz had an article in an exchange with Walter Block in the Review of Austrian Economics years ago about this kind of thing. That's more of a mainstream approach compared to what you would see from Austrians like Murray Rothbard or Walter Block. Rothbard and Block and others in that tradition are going to look more toward natural law, and they'll also see tort law as being important. So there are those in that Kosian tradition that have a high regard for property rights, but I would say that there are some problems with that view, and I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. One of the keys for Austrian economists is a strong adherence to subjective value. And Austrians tend to reject the idea that you can rearrange property rights in search of efficiency, that there will be some problems both ethically and practically when you are trying to do that. And a lot of the environmental regulations and environmental cap and trade rules and the emissions taxes and those kinds of things are based on an idea that you can somehow locate the efficient amount of pollution and then use government policy to try to hit that target. So as Roy Cordato has said, and by the way, he's got a great book on this, which it's been out for a while, but it's really great on this stuff. Efficiency and externalities in an open-ended universe, and that's one that I think is key to understanding this from an Austrian perspective. So if you're not familiar with that, then that would be one to take a look at. But Cordato says that efficiency is an individual goal-seeking problem, not a value maximization problem. So efficiency is attained when legal institutions allow individuals to pursue their ends. All right, so if you are trying to assert that a particular outcome is efficient and you're doing so as a government bureaucrat, you are missing the mark because you don't have enough information to make that kind of decision. We will see conflicts over the use of scarce goods. We can't know what the value of alternative uses are because efficiency is not separable from individual decision making. Costs are subjective. We can't measure them. So if you take a typical economics course on environmental economics, you'll see a diagram something like this. I see that I've lost my chat box here. So want to make sure I got that. So hang on just a second. Let me get that restarted, and I'll come back right to that point. Let's see. Just give me a second. All right. So I'll put this back. There we go. Okay. So if you see a diagram like this in your typical environmental economics textbook, you're going to see your marginal private benefit curve, your marginal private cost curve, your marginal social cost curve. And the idea for your mainstream environmental economist is that the market is going to tend to produce a quantity of output that is too high, this market quantity here, because the emitter of the pollution is only considering the private costs, and they're not considering the costs that fall on bystanders, the pollution costs, you might say. So a paper mill that's generating a bad odor is thinking about the cost of their labor, the cost of the trees, the cost of the water, the cost of the energy, but they're not thinking about the cost of the bad smell that they're generating on bystanders. So what that generates is a dead weight loss. It generates a triangle that's shaded in there between the marginal social cost and the marginal private benefit curve, and causes the outcome to be inefficient. So the typical outcome or response to this from a environmental economist is going to be, well, let's just tax. Let's tax the producer of the externality so that the producer has to take into account the cost of this this byproduct of their production process. So if you chose an alternative, which is popular with a lot of property rights-minded economists, and said, well, instead of a tax, let's try tradable permits. And we've done that in the United States since about 1990 or so with sulfur dioxide. And you can say, well, each emitter of sulfur dioxide gets X number of permits, and if they decide that they can cut back on their pollution in some way, they will be able to sell off any excess permits. So that's supposed to resolve that problem in a market sort of way. Now, it's a made-up market. It's not a real market. It doesn't really reflect the actual costs, because we can't know what those costs really are. And if the government gets this wrong, if they have missed the target, which seems extremely likely, then they might overshoot. They might have a tax that is too high. They're overestimating the costs that are falling on everybody else, and so therefore they tax excessively and can generate an outcome that is no better than what the market generated in terms of efficiency. Of course, we can't really know what that efficient outcome is, but even on the grounds that the mainstream environmental economics scholars are working from, they still can't determine what that ideal outcome would be. And they don't know whether their tax really moved us closer to that outcome or farther away. And particularly since we have to take into consideration that the taxes are politically determined and they're always being influenced by interest groups, the crony capitalism effect. There's no particular reason that an EPA bureaucrat or some other policymaker would have a strong incentive to get that tax exactly right. Even if they knew what that ideal outcome was, they would not have the requisite incentives to put us in that place, as opposed to listening to their various constituent groups. So we would, looking at this from a kind of a diagrammatical perspective, what we'd have to do is take that dead weight loss that we're supposedly regaining from a tax or emissions trading scheme, and subtract from that the cost of the overshoot. And we'd have to subtract as well the cost of bureaucracy and the cost of enforcing the rules, the cost of waste from political lobbying. So all of those lead us to conclude that we really can't guarantee any improvement. And in fact, it's quite possible, even likely, that our outcomes would be worsened, even from the point of view of this kind of mainstream static diagram. There's also a knowledge problem here. Government regulations or taxes to try to resolve externalities run into a problem of poor information and poor incentives. So as Art Carden has pointed out, and by the way, he's another great one on this stuff, he said the information needed to know whether a particular regulation works quite literally does not exist. And the key difference between firms and governments is that firms have market tests for their decisions while governments do not. That's in volume 17 of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. There was an exchange, actually it was most of an issue that was dedicated to these kinds of issues, these kinds of environmental issues a while back. So Art Carden contributed to that. Walter Block contributed to that. Ed Dolan, who I think is with the Niskanen Institute, had a paper in there as well, even though he's not really coming at it from an Austrian perspective. Rothbard in the Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution paper spent some time discussing the ethical considerations, which I think are really critical here, because even if we could calculate what's the ideal level of pollution, which, again, we can't, but even if we could, how would that trump property rights? So really, for Rothbard, it's a matter of violating the property rights of another person. So if you emit pollution, if you dump something into the air and other people had not consented to that, or were not, you had not homesteaded that right to dump that material into the air, then you are violating their rights. You're violating their property rights. So it's not really about exceeding some level of emissions or damaging the environment. It's about a rights issue. You have violated somebody's property rights. So Rothbard said we can't decide on public policy, tort law, rights, or liabilities on the basis of efficiencies or minimizing cost. So then, if not cost, if not efficiency, then what do we use? And he would say that the answer is that we can't go to efficiency considerations as the basis for ethics. Ethics have to be the touchstone for any consideration of efficiency. So in that paper, he said economists are going to have to get used to the idea that not all of life can be encompassed by our own discipline. And he says that's painful, but it might be good for us to recognize our own limits and maybe think more carefully about ethics and justice here. You may have seen this tragedy of the commons idea before. If you've got a common pasture where nobody in particular owns the land, and each farmer has to decide how many livestock to put onto the land. If no one owns it, then the herders gain all of the benefits of the grass their animals eat, but they only suffer part of the cost. And what this does is create a kind of a prisoner's dilemma. So if you've got two ranchers, Al and Bob, and Al and Bob each have 2 cows, and they've got to decide how many cows to put out into this common pasture. If you're looking at these numbers as weight gain, let's say, per day, then if Al is trying to decide how much or how many cows to put onto this pasture, Al could choose either 1 cow or 2. Well, he doesn't really know what Bob's going to do. So if Bob chooses to put 1 cow into the pasture, then Al's choice is either 5 pounds of weight gain if he puts 1 cow out to graze, or 6 pounds of weight gain if he puts 2 cows out to graze. So he's going to choose 2 cows. If Bob is going to choose 2 cows to graze in the pasture, then Al's choice is either 3 pounds or 4 pounds, and he's going to choose, again, 2 cows onto this pasture. So Al is, in either case, going to choose to put 2 cows out to graze. Well, this is completely symmetric, so Bob is facing the same incentives to put 2 cows out to graze on the pasture, which means that we end up here with both of them putting cows out to graze, 2 cows out to graze, and generating less total weight gain than if the 2 ranchers had put only 1 cow out to graze. So this is kind of a tragedy of the commons, kind of a classic presentation of that. You can go back to Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, and see what he says about this. When all members of society compete for a given quantity of goods that is insufficient, a practical solution to this conflict is only conceivable if the goods pass into the possession of some of the economizing individuals, and if these individuals are protected by society in their possession to the exclusion of all other individuals. In other words, if you have property rights that mean something, then you can solve that problem. And that's, fundamentally, that's how we saw the American bison saved, because a few people decided to fence off a small group of bison, and that prevented them from being driven to extinction because they were suffering from that tragedy of the commons. That was what almost drove them into extinction. So Rothbard, again, in this Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution paper from 1973, says, if a private firm owned Lake Erie, then anyone dumping garbage in the lake would promptly be sued in the courts for their aggression against private property. It would be forced by the courts to pay damages and to cease and desist from any further aggression. Only because the rivers are unowned is there no owner to rise up and defend his precious resource from attack. On this, you could see Walter Block and Peter Nelson's book, Water Capitalism, which is, and also Block's 2021 Free Enterprise Environmentalism. So both of those are going to make similar kinds of points, that if you are able to define property rights, then you're going to go a long way towards solving this tragedy of the commons. If you've got this common pasture and one of these ranchers, or maybe they both lease the land from someone else, some third party, they're going to, the owner of that property is going to get the highest returns when the ranchers get the most weight gain from their cows, which means that the owner is going to restrict the use of that property to what is generating the highest return. This guy here, Ronald Kos, is one of the most famous individuals in the field of environmental economics, really one of the most famous individuals in economics. He won a Nobel Prize largely for his work on property rights. He did a lot of work on things like the electromagnetic spectrum, and thought a lot of about what would happen if we had a world in which transaction costs were zero. How would the outcome change? And he did not really argue that transaction costs were zero. So some people say, well, in a Kosian world, and what they mean is that transaction costs are zero. That was not what Kos actually thought, but the Austrian approach stands against this Kosian approach because ultimately in a Kosian approach where you do have transaction costs, a court would have to balance the costs and benefits to both sides and make a determination about who has the rights, and that makes a difference. It neglects the very thing that we mentioned earlier about the subjectivity of costs and benefits. So in a Kos's framework, you don't see a perpetrator and a victim. In Rothbard's framework, you do. In Rothbard's framework, you have the person who owned the property, and then someone else comes along and violates that by dumping pollution onto it. In the Kosian approach, you've got the idea that both parties caused the collision. Both parties caused the externality to exist. So if one example here is the whole debate over masking and so forth. This is a table that Jonathan Newman shared a couple of weeks ago, and I thought this was a great illustration of this kind of concept. And I don't know whether these time limits are correct or not, but basically, if you look at the chart, you've got the people that are not infected, and what are they wearing? And then you've got the person who is infected, and what's that person wearing? And it's a symmetric diagram, which means that the person who is not infected contributes just as much to the possibility of contracting COVID as the person who is infected. Right. So if you think about the argument that we've been seeing a pandemic of the unvaccinated, it's not just the unvaccinated that can contribute to the transmission of a disease. It's also the other person that chose to be around the person who is unvaccinated. If you're concerned about somebody not wearing a mask, well, you're contributing partly to that yourself because you are to some extent in control of what kind of precautionary methods you decide to adopt for yourself. So this is kind of the Kosian idea that there's not a perpetrator and a victim. You've got some responsibility in the fact that you choose to stand around where you can breathe the pollution. And the problem, I think, arises when we fail to take into consideration subjective costs, and that's something that Kos did not do in his work. So the classic example here of a railroad versus the orchards neighboring the railroad or adjacent to the railroad. So a train goes by. It's one of the old-fashioned type that throws sparks from the boiler or the firebox, and then you've got the sparks that fall on the orchard and they burn the orchard down. So I'm going to kind of give you the classic Kosian argument here, and then we'll tear it up using our ideas about subjective costs. So let's suppose the farmer has to suffer the loss of the orchard as long as that train is passing, costing a $100,000 loss to the farmer. So the market value of the property without the orchard is not very high. It's only $15,000. So let's suppose that for the railroad to install a spark reduction device that allows the farmer to continue to have the orchard, this would cost, let's say, $120,000. So the question then is, should the sparks fly or should the orchard grow? What's more valuable, allowing the railroad to go ahead and not use the spark reduction device and save $120,000, or is it more valuable to allow the farmer to continue to grow the orchard and not lose that $100,000 loss of the value of the property? So you can sort of see where the Kosians are going with this. They're going to say, well, obviously the most valuable use of the property is to allow the railroad to continue to throw the sparks, because it would cost the railroad $120,000 to avoid throwing sparks, and it would cost $100,000 if the sparks fly and the farmer loses the orchard. So the mainstream on this is going to say, well, obviously growing trees is going to be inefficient, so the railroad's use of the land is more valuable. So we have a $100,000 reduction in the market value of the property. We have a $120,000 cost of the spark reduction devices. Now, where Kos was going with his comments about no transaction costs is, he said, basically, whichever way the court decides, if transaction costs are zero, the outcome is going to be the same. So he said, let's suppose the farmer gets the rights. The railroad has to pay $120,000 to put the spark arresting devices on the trains. And so the railroad's going to approach the farmer and say, look, it's going to cost us a lot of money to do this. If we just compensate you for the loss of your orchard, would that be okay? Would you accept that? And we could save ourselves $20,000. So the devices don't get installed, the trees are gone. Society gains by $20,000 compared to the alternative. So now let's suppose the railroad got the rights in the court. So the court ruled the other way. The farmer now faces a $100,000 cost of losing the orchard. The farmer is not going to be able to entice the railroad to install the spark reduction device, because the farmer is not going to be able to come up with $120,000 to induce the railroad to do this. The most the farmer can get from the market is the $100,000. That's not going to be enough to entice the railroad to do this. So again, the devices don't get installed, the trees still burn, and the outcome is essentially the same. And again, according to the Kosian, society gains by $20,000 relative to the alternative. Now, here's where the Austrian is going to object, and I think rightly so. Let's suppose the market value of the orchard is not the entire value of the orchard. Let's suppose there's a $900,000 psychological loss to the farmer. Who knows why this is? Maybe the orchard was planted by his great-great-grandparents, or maybe his maybe the orchard is sacred to him or something. We know that most items that we have in our possession have a value to us that is higher than the value to the rest of the market. Well, absent transaction costs. I don't have a for sale sign in front of my house. And the reason I don't is that I can't get a buyer to pay me what this house would be worth to me. So there's a value of this house that I live in that is higher than what the rest of the market is willing to pay. So this is not really a stretch to think of items having a value that is higher than what the market as a whole would place on that same item. So $120,000 cost of the spark reduction devices. Now let's suppose the railroad gets the rights, but the total market value of the property was only $115,000, $100,000 of which would be lost if the farmer's orchard gets burned. So the farmer's not going to be able to raise $120,000 to induce the railroad to install these devices. And so the devices don't get installed, the orchard disappears, but here society is going to lose because you have to subtract the $900,000 psychological loss to the farmer. So once you do that, you realize that society is not gaining by the court making the decision for the railroad to get the rights. The court ruling does make a difference, and it does matter whether there's a victim and a perpetrator in this situation. So ultimately, efficiency is not guaranteed by this Kosian judge, even if you had zero transaction costs, which, again, you don't. So what's the Rothbardian alternative? The Rothbardian alternative is ownership, which is strictly maintained. You have homesteading as a basis for that ownership. And that can be not just your classic homesteading of land where some settler goes out onto some uninhabited property and fences it off and tills the ground and claims ownership, but also homesteading over things like the noise level or the air quality. And so is air going to be used as a dumping ground? Is air going to be used as a source of breathable air? I mean, these are conflicting uses to some extent. Excessive noise can be considered a form of aggression unless the noise has been generated by someone who has sort of homesteaded that right. So, for example, let's suppose an airport is built with a lot of empty land around it, and the airport generates a certain noise level. And then a housing development buys land near the airport, and then the homeowners sue the airport for excessive noise. Well, Rothbard's going to say, look, the airport owns the right to emit X decibels of noise in that area because that's what they were doing before the housing development was constructed. So from the Rothbardian perspective on this, the first comer is the one who has the property rights. There's a lot in that paper, the 73 paper on trespass versus nuisance. I won't get into all of that here because I want to allow plenty of time for questions, which I think could be useful more than going through all of that. But basically, Rothbard's going to say, look, it's the distinction between what you can sense, which interferes with your possession and use of the property, and then insensible boundary crossings that don't interfere with your use of the property. So if somebody transmits radio waves across your land, and they pass across your property and even through your body, unless you can prove that this is adversely affecting your health or your use of the property, then you have no grounds to complain about that. You have no case. But if you are adversely affected, if you can show that, and you can show that a particular producer of those radio waves or whatever the emissions are, has generated those and is causing that damage to you, then you've got a case. So the key principles of liability from that paper are that, first, the polluter is liable if the polluter does not already have a homestead easement. Insensible pollutants require the plaintiff to actually prove harm, which might be difficult. And the burden of proof rests on the plaintiff. The plaintiff would have to prove strict causality from the actions of the defendant to the victimization of the plaintiff. The plaintiff would have to prove that causality and aggression beyond a reasonable doubt. And finally, there's no vicarious liability, but only liability for people that actually commit the deed. So you can't be a bystander and say, well, I'm offended that this other person is having to breathe smoke, and therefore I'm going to file suit on their behalf. Sorry, that's in this framework, that's not permitted. Only the victim can press suit. Somebody else, like a district attorney, would not have any standing in that kind of thing. I'll wrap up by just mentioning the problem of multiple emitters, and this is really a difficult problem. What if there are a lot of dispersed nuisance creators or a lot of dispersed victims? So you've got some factory that's generating air pollution, and it spreads over possibly millions and millions of people who are breathing that air. Is the host responsible? One of the ways that libertarians have tried to handle this is to say, well, look, there's no particular reason to absolve the owner of a road for responsibility for the emissions of those who are using the road, right? So, you can avoid the problem of having to deal with millions of car owners, each of whom are generating a very small amount of pollution out of their tailpipe of their car, and say, look, and if we have, instead of a government owning roads, if we've got the private sector owning roads, then you can go after the owner of the road for that pollution. The class action lawsuit idea has been used to try to gain some traction on cases where there are a lot of victims, or in some cases you might say that this could apply well beyond the externalities issues that we're talking about here. But from a libertarian perspective, it's really problematic to join together people who are allegedly victims who haven't participated in the suit but are still bound by the outcome of the suit. And you've probably gotten one of those postcards in the mail that says somebody is filing a class action lawsuit on your behalf, and you are by default going to be joined in that suit unless you respond by a certain date and say that I don't want to be part of this class action suit. So there are some problems with involuntarily pushing people into that victim status that they really didn't want, and then coming up with some sort of settlement or court outcome that is then binding on them when they did not explicitly agree to it. Ed Dolan has I think an important article which there's some problems with it, which I'm actually working on a response to myself, where he says, look, environmental mass torts are something that Austrian environmental economics isn't really handling very well, where you've got a lot of victims or a lot of polluters, and if there's not an easy way to join them together, like with private road ownership, then what do you do? And he suggests that there is a role for the state in trying to handle these environmental mass torts. Beyond the ability of this short talk to deal with all of those issues in what Dolan has said. I think that was in the same volume 17 of the QJAE, and that's something that I've recommended that students read as well if they're interested in going further with that. I think I'm going to see if I can get my screen to stop sharing here, and then I'll pay attention to your questions if I can get that to come back up on my screen. Yeah. So I think they wanted maybe about 15 minutes for questions, and maybe that would be a place to start. Rich, do you have any direction for me on that?
Yeah, I can read out the questions for you here, just so we can try to get through as many as possible.
Okay.
First question here comes from Castor Troy, and he asked what I think is a really interesting question. He says, if cost is the value given up as a result of choice to the person making the choice, how can economists say that a negative externality is a cost imposed on another person? Are economists just equivocating on this term? And if so, what does that mean for the field at large?
Exactly. I mean, that's a great, I think it's a core question, really. And it's something that I was thinking about recently when I started looking at environmental regulations and thinking about that cost issue, where most environmental regulations are looking at a particular quantity of sulfur dioxide or a quantity of carbon monoxide or lead or whatever the pollutant is, and they're trying to use that as a proxy for the cost that it's imposing on someone else, and that's really impossible. I mean, we can't really say that that we can't make any sense out of that. You know, and the is it even a cost if someone dumps sulfur dioxide into the air around me? That itself takes some assumptions that may or may not be valid. And that sulfur dioxide is one where I don't know of anyone who says, oh yes, I enjoy having that in my atmosphere. But let's take something like pipe smoke. Okay. So I used to have a colleague at the college where I teach who smoked a pipe on a regular basis. And if I happened to be crossing campus at the same time as him, then I would smell his pipe tobacco. And for me, I thought that was kind of a pleasant smell. Other people might have been dreadfully offended by it. So for me, it would, from a mainstream perspective, I would have called that a positive externality. And for other people, they would have referred to that as a negative externality. So it's not at all clear in some cases what even the direction of the externality. And so that's yes, another problem. I'd hate to say that. Well, I mean, I think that's adequate to just leave it at that. If you cannot estimate another person's opportunity that they are giving up because of the pollution that you're generating in their vicinity, then you have no way to assert some sort of right of government to control the emissions that other person is generating. I don't know if that helps or not, but that's kind of my take on that.
Next question here comes from Komodo Dragon, and he asks, how does pollution affect the price of property in a free market, and how might the insurance industry be involved in this?
Yeah, so it's, in the insurance industry might be one way to handle some of the those mass torts. I did a project years ago with a student. You have to forgive me for the mainstream methodology of this project, but I was kind of curious to see how this would turn out. And what we did is we looked at a local lake that had been drained, and looked at the decline in the property values of the lots that were bordering the lake during the time that the lake was drained. So that's not really pollution, but it was a diminishing of the value of lakeside property. Presumably people bought their lakeside property because they enjoyed having water at the end of their dock instead of a vast mud flat, which is what happened after the lake was drained. So you can use methods like that, or I wouldn't recommend it. People use methods like that to try to estimate the losses to pollution. Now we go straight back to that problem that I mentioned earlier with Kos, where you're eliminating the possibility of psychological losses, and you're looking only at changes in market values when you do that. And so you're missing a lot. And you might even be missing most of the story there. But yes, insurance companies could be involved in that. If you, and they are in a way already, if you live in an area which has exposure to a lot of, we'll call them trespass problems from air pollutants or other kinds of side effects of somebody else's consumption or production activity, then your insurance premiums will be higher as a result. So your property values could be lower, your insurance premiums could be higher, and I think that if you take this to a kind of you'd have to do some reading here on Hoppe and his thoughts about insurance companies and the role that they could play in a free market society, and I don't want to really dive into that too much here. But yeah, an insurance company could end up being a major player in reducing some of those side effects, some of those costs. In order to live in this community, you have to be insured by this particular insurance company, and the insurance company is going to impose some rules on what you can emit and what you can't. So yeah, I mean there's a lot we could say about the role of insurance companies, but I think generally that could be one way to try to address some of this.
All right, and for our next question here, I'm going to exercise my moderator privilege and ask my own question. One thing that you hear about a lot in the field of environmental economics, almost ad nauseum, is this idea of a carbon tax, especially in the United States. You hear about carbon taxes all the time, and how carbon taxes are a great idea and we need to institute them now. And carbon taxes have this salvific property almost that, okay, we just need to have carbon taxes and we'll be able to solve so many of the problems we experience today. So I'm just curious if you could comment a little bit on the idea of the carbon tax, maybe some of the problems that exist with it as it's commonly portrayed.
Yeah, so this might be where we need to go back to those graphs. I won't pull those up again, but the problem with the carbon tax is that it's always predicated on the idea that the government knows how much carbon should be emitted, and that it knows something about the costs of that carbon on billions of individuals. And there's really no way to measure any of that. We don't know what the ideal quantity of carbon is, and we couldn't even the idea of an ideal is untenable from our perspective, because we can't combine the preferences of millions or billions of individuals who are all going to either gain or suffer from different levels of carbon emissions. And I don't get into the question of what's happening with global warming. Is more global warming good or bad, or is it caused by what people are doing, or is it caused by variations in solar cycles, or what's going on? I'm kind of agnostic on a lot of that, at least officially. And so I apart from that, even if we did know what the ideal temperature of the planet was, we would not have any way to impose a tax that would get us to that point. it also has that problem of crony capitalism that I mentioned earlier, where you've got groups that are pushing for a reduction of carbon emissions because they've got their own axe to grind. It's either an ideological axe or there's something else. So I put up a blog post a few days ago on the use of liquefied petroleum gas in developing countries. You've got a lot of people in wealthier countries that are pushing the developing world to adopt renewable energy, solar, wind, that kind of thing. And what they're not seeing in this pursuit of zero carbon is that a lot of these countries are going to be severely adversely affected by this. Their development is going to be stunted because they need to have things like liquefied petroleum gas as a transition to anything that would be more expensive or higher tech in some way. So carbon taxes can do a lot of damage, even if you've got good intentions. And then if you are complicating this with interest groups that are pushing for the adoption of mandatory wind power, solar power, then you've simply exacerbated the problem.
All right, next question here comes from Nico, and he asks, in your paper, The Origin of Property Rights, you critique Rothbard and Hoppe on self-ownership based in a very well-put biblical argument. I was wondering what the economic implications might be in the difference between the self-ownership theories and your ethical framework.
That paper, I think that was probably 20 years ago now that came out. There were actually two papers in that same vein. And my basic argument in this, and this gets into maybe a little far afield of what we were aiming at tonight, but my basic argument in that paper is a theistic argument. I was arguing that ultimately we don't own ourselves. As a Christian, I believe God owns us, and therefore he gets to decide what the rules are. And so there are questions about whether, what role does natural law play in all of this versus revelatory law, and that really is beyond the pale of what we can get into here tonight. But basically, that's my sticking point. I think there is a lot to gain from what Rothbard and Hoppe have argued, but I don't think they go far enough back. It's basically my contention that, yes, we own ourselves, but in my view, it's more of a custodial ownership rather than an absolute ownership. And that has some implications for a lot of very controversial issues, which if you read that article of mine, you're aware of where we go with that. And basically I would say we are custodians of our bodies, and we do have rights over the things that we homestead. So I can go 90% of the way with Rothbard and that homesteading argument, but I go back a little further and I say those rights are restricted. I don't expect everybody to agree with me on that, but that's the essence of what I was arguing in those earlier papers.
Next question here comes from Weaver, and he asks, whenever it comes to the commons, the often cited tragedy can be solved with property rights. But how can this be done, for an example, like space for satellites orbiting the Earth? Whenever it comes to something like a lake, homesteading and property rights is easy, but what about this newer example?
I've got a book review of a book that was published maybe, I don't know, it's probably 10 or 12 years ago now, about that very issue on property rights over space. And space actually is not quite as wide open as we might think. There are particular points in space which are ideal for the location of certain kinds of satellites, geosynchronous orbits and Lagrangian points, and a lot of other stuff that I don't really understand. But space is getting a little more cluttered than I would be comfortable with if I were circling the Earth in a space station. I can say that we've seen even in the news cases where space stations have to move out of the way of some kind of particle, man-made piece of space junk that's flying around. So this is one of those cases where the property rights regime is probably not going to look very much like it does in a more two-dimensional world on the crust of the Earth. And I'm not really sure what it would look like. I will take this opportunity to point out that one of the common arguments that libertarians will face is, well, if you can't come up with the particular way that this property rights conflict would be solved, then your whole theory is just worthless. And that's not, that's not the way to argue appropriately with our position. The market would evolve in ways that we cannot foresee. We don't really know what that property rights regime would look like. It is pretty easy to figure it out when it's about pastures and barbed wire. It is not so easy when you've got spacecraft. Speculating here with the caveat that I mentioned earlier, you could say if you're the first person to put a spacecraft in a particular elliptical orbit around the Earth, then you've got the right to continue to keep that spacecraft in that orbit. You've homesteaded it. And if somebody comes along and crashes into it, they owe you compensation for the loss of your satellite or whatever it is you've got in orbit. So maybe it doesn't look like something where you would define the boundaries as we do on Earth. Maybe it would look more like a particular orbit that you've homesteaded. That's about as far as I can go on that. So,
all right. And for last question here, I'll just ask a little bit more of an open-ended question. And I'll say, it seems like concerns over things like global warming and things of that nature seem to be reaching a little bit of a fevered pitch over the last few years or so. So I'm curious where you think this subfield of environmental economics, which is related to the issues of global warming and things like that, where do you think this subfield is going to be going into the near and maybe even distant future?
There's the practical and then there's the theoretical on that. And I think practically the solution, to the extent that we need a solution to changing global temperature, is going to take the form of people adapting to changes in global temperature. I cannot think of a way in which the responsible parties for changes in temperature could be identified, or even if there would be a way to determine for sure if the changes are man-made or to what extent they are man-made. Again, I don't get into a lot of those debates, but it is. I cannot imagine a case in which we could identify the responsible parties and say, well, you're responsible for the fact that I have to, move my beachfront hotel because of rising sea levels. But what I have seen practically indicates that the changes are slow enough that people will be able to adapt to those changes. And that we'll be able to see not only changes in how people locate their structures on any coastline that might be affected, but we might also see some changes in the kinds of crops people grow, the kinds of whether people choose to live in warmer climates over time or cooler climates over time, depending on changes in energy costs. Those changes would occur in a slow enough manner, I think, that what we will actually see is a gradual shifting that most people don't even notice. I am I'm not particularly concerned myself about drastic short-term increases in costs that would be due to some kind of climate change. Again, I'm not a climatologist. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but looking at how markets have responded so far to threats of global warming, it does not look like markets are taking that kind of wisdom of crowds there. It doesn't look like markets are particularly concerned about that either. What we do see is a lot of politically motivated push toward using this type of energy versus that type of energy, and that I am concerned about. My aforementioned comment about the developing world and how they are being pushed away from very accessible and appropriate energy sources like LPG toward energy sources that are really very impractical for them, very expensive, and likely to result in more people breathing high levels of indoor air pollution because they're burning charcoal to cook with instead of relatively clean carbon-based natural gas. So I think that where the action is in a lot of the global warming stuff is on the what impact is the reactive policy going to have on the lives of mostly the developing world. We in the industrialized part of the world, the wealthier parts of the world, don't really see the impact of those policy decisions like others do. We already have pretty reliable electric power, et cetera, and we're pretty comfortable with that. And we might see our bill go up a little bit, but it's not like we're faced with the same kinds of dire consequences of these energy policy shifts that people in poorer countries would be faced with. So I think that's where we need to focus our intellectual efforts on trying to combat policies that are going to make the lives of billions of people significantly worse.
All right. And on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Terrell, for joining us here tonight. For everybody in the audience here, thank you very much for showing up to listen. For anyone interested in a recording, the recording should be available sometime within the next few days on the YouTube channel. So we'll send out an announcement whenever that is available if you want to go back and watch through the presentation again or anything like that. That'll be available within the next few days. So yeah, thank you all very much for coming. Hope you have a great rest of your day.